Once you're comfortable with the first two steps in taking better pictures, perspective and composition, it's time to stop using the auto mode. Every camera has a manual mode. With pocket point-and-shoot cameras, this mode allows you to set the white balance and ISO, but everything else is still automated. With more advanced point-and-shoot cameras and DSLR cameras, you can control the camera's aperture size and shutter speed, as well as white balance and ISO. All of these settings will change a picture in some way, and they all have to do with one thing: light. Think of white balance as the color of light. In this picture, the light is coming from the tungsten streetlights in the scene. Tungsten light, or any regular household light bulb, is very yellow, and with the camera set to auto, it just can't compensate. Simply changing the camera's white balance setting to match the scene's light greatly improved the color quality of this picture. White balance is different from the other three settings in that it has nothing to do with the picture's exposure, only its color. For pocket camera users who like to keep it as simple as possible, I would recommend setting the white balance and leaving everything else up to the camera. As I mentioned before, ISO, shutter speed, and the aperture all have to do with the picture's exposure, meaning they can affect the brightness of the image. ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the camera will be. Unfortunately, with a higher ISO, the picture will have more noise or grain. The shutter speed is the amount of time it takes to capture the image. The longer the shutter speed is open, the more light enters the camera and the brighter the image. The aperture is the size of the hole in the lens. Every lens has a hole in it to allow light to pass through. By changing the aperture setting, you're changing the size of that hole, and by doing so, you're also changing the depth of field, which I'll get back to in a bit. So anytime you take a picture, only a certain amount of light is available. The camera can see this and sets the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture so the picture is not too bright and not too dark. But what if the camera doesn't know what you're taking a picture of, or how you want the picture to look? This is why the automated settings may not always be the best. So understanding these three settings and how each plays its part is important even if you're not controlling each one. It's perfectly okay to let the camera help out with one or more of these settings so you can focus more on having fun. So how do these settings work together? Let's say this is our scene. Right now the ISO is set to 100, the shutter speed is set to 1/60th of a second, and the aperture is set to f2.8. Increase the ISO to make the camera more sensitive to light. If the other two settings don't change, the picture becomes brighter. Now I can make the shutter speed faster to cut the amount of light entering the camera. This will also help stop fast-moving targets. Or instead, I can choose a smaller aperture opening to reduce the amount of light entering the camera. This will also increase the depth of field, making everything from the foreground to the background in focus. Depth of field refers to the amount of the scene that's in focus. A wide aperture results in a shallow depth of field, and a narrow aperture will get you more of the scene in focus. So for example, a sports picture needs a fast shutter speed to stop the action. A portrait needs a wide aperture to blur the background. A landscape needs a narrow aperture to get everything from near to far in focus. And for sunsets, a low ISO setting is recommended to get the cleanest image with the best colors possible. Now that you understand these settings, you can choose to set one or more to get the results you want and have the camera automatically set the others. If you're happy with the results from the auto mode, that's fine. I would just recommend setting at least the white balance, especially if you're not in daylight. And keep the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture settings in mind next time the auto mode isn't producing the picture you thought it would. To find out much more about digital photography and your digital camera, go to lbguides.com.